There are places in the universe that no one should ever enter, not because they are difficult, but because entering them is a final sentence. It doesn't matter how advanced your ship is. It doesn't matter how much energy you have. It doesn't matter how fast you are. One miscalculated step, and the universe itself becomes your prison. Today, we are traveling to those places, regions of space where escape is physically impossible, where return simply does not exist, and where even light loses the battle. This is Impossible Horizon, and today you are entering a cosmic death trap. When we think of a trap, our minds imagine something very specific. Walls, bars, locked doors, cells, padlocks. We imagine a structure designed by someone with the explicit intent to prevent escape. But the universe doesn't work that way. In space, there are no walls, no bars, no floors or ceilings, no doors to be slammed shut. And yet, the most perfect prisons known to man exist there. Prisons from which no one has ever escaped, not because no one was brave enough, but because reality itself prevents it. A cosmic trap isn't a place that someone decided to turn into a jail. It's not a construction, it's not a machine, and it's not a weapon. It is something far more unsettling, a direct consequence of physical laws. These are regions of the universe where the rules that allow for movement, energy, and life stop playing in your favor. Places where nature doesn't hunt you down, it simply imprisons you without effort. In these regions, gravity doesn't just pull you, it condemns you. It isn't a gentle tug, it's an invisible slope that becomes harder to climb with every passing second until you reach a point where climbing is no longer an option. In other zones, radiation is so extreme that any organic molecule is torn apart before you can even react. There is no holding on, there is no resisting, there is only the instantaneous destruction of every living structure. In other areas, the energy is so brutal that even the toughest matter cannot maintain its form. Ships stop being ships, metals stop being metals, and everything turns into uncontrolled white-hot particles. And in some places, something even stranger happens. Time stops behaving as it always has. Now stretches out, after becomes a blur, and the very concept of escape begins to lose its meaning. These are not designed traps. They weren't created with intent or planned. They exist because the universe, by obeying its own rules, automatically generates zones where the exit simply ceases to exist. They aren't prisons with guards, they are prisons with physical laws. They don't watch you, they don't hunt you, they don't punish you. They simply never give back what goes in. And that makes them the most perfect traps that have ever existed. It doesn't matter what your technology is, it doesn't matter what you know, it doesn't matter how brave you are. If you cross certain boundaries of the cosmos, the word escape ceases to have any meaning. To understand the universe's most perfect trap, you first have to forget a very common idea. Gravity is not just a force that pulls things down. Gravity is something much deeper. It is a curvature of reality, an invisible warping of space and time. Imagine a stretched cloth, perfectly taut. Now place a heavy ball in the center. The cloth sinks. That is exactly what happens in the universe. Stars, planets, and massive objects don't just float in space, they sink into it. And the more massive an object is, the deeper that depression becomes. That depression is what physicists call a gravity well. At first, the slope is gentle. You can enter and leave without much trouble. But as you get closer to the center, the slope becomes steeper. Every meter costs more energy. Every attempt to move away demands more speed, more fuel, more power, until you reach a critical point. A point where the slope stops being a hill and becomes a vertical precipice. That is the moment when the gravity well stops being a difficulty and transforms into a final trap. From that point on, it's not that escaping is hard, it's that escaping is no longer physically possible. You can fire your engines, you can burn all your fuel, you can accelerate to the ultimate limit of matter, but there will be no way out. Because you are no longer trying to climb a slope, you are trying to climb an infinite wall of reality. And this is not science fiction, it is a direct consequence of general relativity. The most extreme example of this phenomenon, and also the most famous, are black holes. A black hole is not just a collapsed star. It is a point where the curvature of space-time becomes so deep that the gravity well has no observable bottom. It is not an object in the classic sense. It is a region where reality has been stretched to the breaking point. Around it, everything swirls. Light, dust, planets, energy, everything falls. But not inward as we usually imagine. It falls toward a direction in space where a path back no longer exists. And this is what makes extreme gravity wells the supreme trap of the universe. Because they don't hunt you, they don't attack you, they don't suck you in like a monster. They simply let you fall. And once you cross a certain limit, the universe, in silence, removes all the ladders. There is a point in extreme gravity wells where the trap stops being progressive and becomes absolute. A limit where maybe no longer exists, where we can still get out disappears. That limit has a name that sounds almost poetic, but its meaning is devastating: the event horizon. It's not a wall, it's not a solid surface, it's not a visible border. You can cross it without noticing anything strange at all in that moment. There is no jolt, no impact, no cosmic alarm going off. From your point of view, everything seems the same, and that is precisely the most unsettling part. Because the event horizon doesn't mark a change in what you feel, it marks a change in what is possible. Up until that moment, escaping was getting harder and harder. From that moment on, escaping ceases to exist as an option in the universe. There is no engine that can overcome it, no sufficient energy, no clever maneuver, no shortcut. From that point forward, every single future trajectory, without exception, leads towards the interior of the trap. Not because something is pushing you, but because space itself no longer offers a single direction for an exit. From the outside, something even stranger happens. A distant observer never sees you cross the event horizon. They see you approach slower and slower, as if time were beginning to stretch exclusively for you. Your image turns reddish, dark, faint, until, finally, you vanish. To the outside universe, you are frozen at the edge of the trap. But for you, inside of it, the story is very different. For you, time continues to move normally. You don't remain suspended, you don't stop. You cross the limit and continue to fall. At that point, the concept of return stops being a physical option. Not because you made a wrong choice, but because the structure of time itself no longer allows for a way back. The event horizon doesn't just lock you in space, it locks you within the future itself. Everything that awaits you from that moment on points in only one direction. There are no forks in the road, no alternative paths, no turns. There is only the fall. And that is the true terror of the event horizon. It isn't a place where you die immediately. It's a place where your fate is sealed. A boundary where the universe, without words, tells you, from here, there is no turning back. Let's imagine for a moment that a human being, by some impossible means, approached one of these definitive gravitational traps, not with a ship, not in a suit, but as a vulnerable body made of bone, water, and tissue. The first thing we must understand is this: space does not kill in just one way. It kills in layers, one after another. Long before gravity can destroy you, the environment would have already begun its work. Pressure would vanish in an instant. Oxygen would be ripped from your lungs all at once. The fluids in your body would begin to boil without the need for heat, driven only by the total absence of pressure. You wouldn't feel immediate pain. The brain takes time to process it. What you would feel first is an absolute disorientation, dizziness, darkness, a sensation of internal expansion for which no instinct exists. Then would come the invisible damage, radiation piercing through every cell, tearing through DNA as if it were wet paper, silently decomposing the chemical structure of life itself. But that would only be the beginning. As you drew closer to an extreme gravity well, like that of a black hole, something even stranger would happen. Gravity would no longer pull on you as a single block. It would pull on you in pieces. Your feet would be subjected to a very different force than your head. Your body would begin to stretch, millimeter by millimeter, vertebra by vertebra. Physicists call this spaghettification, an almost absurd name for one of the most violent processes nature can exert. Your atoms would stop maintaining their relative positions, molecules would drift apart, tissues would become threads, and finally, no recognizable structures would remain. But here is the most unsettling detail of all. In certain types of black holes, especially supermassive ones, this process might not be immediate. You could cross the event horizon without noticing anything extraordinary for a few seconds or even minutes. You would still be thinking, you would still be conscious, you would know that you have crossed a point of no return, and you would still be alive. Except your life would no longer have any possible future that didn't end in absolute destruction. There would be no redeeming pain, no rescue, no outside intervention. There would only be a slow fall toward an inevitable end, a fall where time, matter, and the very concept of a body begin to lose all meaning. And when gravity finally overcomes every chemical force in the universe, when not even atoms can hold themselves together, then, and only then, the human body would cease to exist even as an idea. There would be no remains, no footprints, no trace, as if it had never been there at all.
Black holes are the most famous trap, the most extreme, the most definitive. But the universe doesn't need to create such spectacular monsters to turn a place into a death sentence. There are other traps just as lethal, though less known, where there is no visible horizon, but there is an inevitable end. Extreme radiation zones. There are regions of space where radiation is so intense that no complex organism can survive for even a few seconds. Near certain neutron stars, for example, magnetic fields are trillions of times stronger than Earth's. There, atoms don't just break, they are deconfigured. Electrons are ripped away instantly, molecules fall apart, and matter stops behaving like matter. In those places, you wouldn't die from wounds or suffocation. You would die because your body would cease to be chemically viable, not through violence, but because the very structure of life cannot exist there. Entering such a region is like trying to live inside an invisible flare. Regions of absolute cold. There are also traps where the enemy isn't heat, but cold beyond any human experience. Far from the stars, in the great depths of space, the temperature drops dangerously close to absolute zero. In these environments, atoms almost stop moving, vibration fades away, and thermal energy vanishes. Matter becomes rigid, fragile, brittle. A human body there wouldn't freeze like in a movie. There would be no spectacular frost. What would happen is worse. The chemical reactions that sustain life would simply stop, metabolism would collapse, and cells would cease to function as living systems. There would be no struggle, no prolonged agony, only a silent transition from the living to the inert. collective gravity wells. You don't need a black hole to be trapped without an exit. There are regions of space where the gravity of thousands of stars adds up into an invisible web. Massive star clusters, galactic swarms, regions where gravity doesn't pull toward a single point, but rather toward many at once. In these places, a ship can get caught in chaotic orbits that don't lead outward, but rather into closed loops over and over again. You wouldn't die instantly, but you wouldn't escape either. You could drift for thousands of years, burning energy, slowly losing any chance of exit. It would be a slow, silent trap, but just as final. Planets with lethal gravity. And then there are the worlds. Planets so massive that gravity crushes even the toughest technology. In one of these places, your own weight would become your enemy. Your bones would endure monstrous forces, your organs would collapse under their own volume, and breathing would become impossible. You wouldn't even be able to stand. And you wouldn't die from an impact, you would die from internal compression, from the brutal weight of a planet that was not made for human bodies. These traps don't look like monsters, they don't roar, they don't hunt, they simply exist. And in doing so, they establish an uncomfortable truth. The universe doesn't just challenge us, it also forbids us. There are regions where it's not that we don't know how to reach them, it's that even if we did reach them, we could not stay, nor could we return.
After seeing all these traps, gravity wells, the event horizon, radiation, absolute cold, impossible planets, it might seem that the true enemy of human beings in the universe is the brute force of nature. But that is not the deepest trap. The most unsettling trap is not made of gravity or radiation or energy. It is made of consciousness. Because human beings are strange creatures. We are capable of imagining places we can never reach. We are capable of calculating distances we can never travel. We are capable of understanding laws that, at the same time, tell us there are things we can never overcome. We know that absolute frontiers exist, and yet we dream of crossing them. We dream of escaping our own planet, of moving between stars, of leaving our fragility behind. But physics is relentless. It does not negotiate, it is not moved, and it makes no exceptions. It allows us to advance up to a certain point, and then places us before an invisible wall. A wall without matter, without surface, without cracks. A wall made of impossibility. And that creates a silent paradox within us. On one hand, we are an exploring species, curious, restless, tireless. On the other, we are a limited species, trapped by the speed of light, by available energy, by the irreversible passage of time. The true trap is not being locked in a region of space. The true trap is knowing that the universe is immense and that our capacity to traverse it is minuscule. It is understanding that there are places that only existed to be observed from afar, that there are frontiers that are only there to remind us that not everything was made for us. And perhaps in that clash between what we desire and what is possible lies the deepest trap of all. A mind capable of imagining the infinite, trapped in a finite body. When we look up at the sky on a quiet night, we don't see traps, we don't see borders, we don't see sentences. We see light, we see silence, we see beauty. But now you know that, hidden among those lights, are regions where the universe stops being a place and becomes a destination with no way out. Traps without bars, prisons without walls, sentences handed down not by judges, but by equations. And yet, even knowing all this, we keep looking up. We keep launching probes, we keep sending signals, we keep dreaming of traveling further than we have ever gone. Because perhaps human beings are not defined by the places we can be, but by the places we dare to imagine, even knowing we will never set foot there. Maybe the point of exploring isn't to conquer every corner of the cosmos, but to accept that there are frontiers that weren't made to be crossed, but to be understood. And in that understanding, in that act of looking at the impossible without turning away, there is a very silent form of freedom. Because there may be a place from which we would never escape. There may be absolute traps in the universe. There may be fates sealed by physics. But as long as we can think about them, as long as we can understand them, as long as we can tell their story, we remain in some way one step outside the trap. This was Impossible Horizon, and today, for a moment, you have looked directly at a frontier that cannot be crossed without ever having to enter it.